Welcome to Minority Trip Report. MTR is a podcast spotlighting stories of personal transformation and underrepresented leaders in mental health, psychedelics, and consciousness. I'm your host, Raj Siraj. If you're learning from or enjoying Minority Trip Report, please subscribe to MTR on YouTube at Minority Trip Report and follow us on Instagram at Minority Trip. Thank you and enjoy the episode. Today, my guest is Simran Sethi, who is a multimedia journalist, academic, and consultant, endlessly curious about the people and places that nourish and heal us. Her current research as a visiting academic at Puffin Centre at the Open University in Milton Keynes, UK, is focused on exploring ways to dismantle systems of oppression in support of the biocultural diversity of sacred plant medicines. Simran is the founder of Asian Psychedelic Collective, an evolving space of belonging and support for Asians working with and in psychedelics. She's also the fellow at Culture Hack Labs and a member of the first Fireside Project Equity cohort, ensuring culturally responsive peer support for psychedelic experiences. Named one of the 50 most influential global Indians by Vogue India and the environmental messenger by Vanity Fair, Simran has written for outlets including the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic, Smithsonian, Guernica, and The Guardian. Simran is the author of Bread, Wine, Chocolate, The Slow Loss of Foods We Love. Simran, thank you so much for being here.
I'm so happy to. Finally, at long last, we get to chat.
Yeah, and you just finished a shift at Fireside as well. So I really appreciate you taking the time, being at service to the community as well as the podcast as well. Thank you so much. As I mentioned, so we're going to go through quite a bit of your journey. But as always, I always start from like let's just say, ground zero, right? Or not day one necessarily as you were escaping the womb. But I'm always curious about the setting, the formative years of somebody's life, your relationship to your parents, how your parents came to the US and so on, how you relate to your culture, things like that. So why don't we start there in terms of who was Simran and who was Simran's parents? Let's start there.
Who is Simran now? Okay, we're traversing a lot in that question. So
I'm all about loaded questions.
Yeah, exactly. I'll begin at the beginning, which is I was born in Germany to parents of Indian descent. I prefer to use the term South Asian because we were all split apart because of colonization. My dad was born in what's now Pakistan, walked to India during partition. My mom was born in Uganda. She was sent away to India to study when she was just a small child, age 7, while her family was still in Uganda. And then eventually, when Idi Amin came in, all Indians had to leave. So just some displacement running through my veins. My dad won scholarships to both East and West Germany. My family on the paternal side lost everything during partition. My paternal grandfather was a pharmacist, so that shop didn't travel with them. And they ended up in really impoverished circumstances. And so education was the ticket for him to really get out of those circumstances. And when he won that scholarship, it was for a master's degree. And he ended up completing a PhD, continuing in my Dadaji's legacy of my Dadaji was a pharmacist. My dad became a clinical pharmacologist. My mom, meanwhile, was studying, in India. She went on to get her master's, which wasn't something that a lot of women did back in the day. Gosh, I don't know what decade that was. I want to say maybe the 60s. But she had an arranged marriage. They had an arranged marriage. My mother's the oldest of 7 siblings. And so there was a lot of pressure for her to get married. And what she would say is my dad wasn't the most attractive or the wealthiest by far. I know, but it's true, but whatever. But he was the one who could show her the world. Like he was the most interesting and
wise choice always.
Exactly. And they got married. She finished her master's and then moved to Munich, which is where I was born. And then the National Institutes of Health here in the United States sponsored my father to come to the United States, to this area, Washington, D.C., which is actually, I've returned to this area now. It's a bit of a sort of a homecoming. And yeah, this is where he continued his cancer research. He also worked with Bob Gallo, who is co-credited with discovering HIV. So he did some really important work and then eventually was recruited by Wake Forest University's School of Medicine to go down south. So we moved to North Carolina when I was 5 years old, and I was raised there in the South until going to university in Massachusetts. And then from there, all over the world. I've lived now on 1, 2, 3, 4 continents, lived and worked on 4, and then traveled and researched on 6.
When did you learn about, I don't know if your parents told you the stories of partition and migration and immigration and all these other movements. When did you become
Mhm.
aware of these things, particularly your South Asian heritage and what happened during the
Mhm.
partition?
Yeah. So I'll split those questions. Being aware of South Asian heritage always, because I was always different. My most notable kind of like an immediate kind of othering that I remember is moving first day of, I think it was kindergarten or first grade in North Carolina. Blonde kid with a very thick Southern accent said, "Is Christ your savior?" And I'm bamboozled by the question. I'm like, "No." He said, "Then you're going to hell." So that was the entry. My family is Sikh and Hindu. And from that point on, it was like always being aware that I was different.
Mm,
And during like Christmas, New Year time, or I should say Thanksgiving, Christmas time in the US, like November on, everyone would have their Christmas trees. Everyone would have, of course, there's Christians in South Asia, but like we're not them. And so we didn't have these things. My parents were really adamant against kind of performative stuff and commercialized stuff. And I think anybody who immigrates knows there's this give and take, right? So you hold on to some things, like we held on to our faith. Not that we were like practicing much of anything, but we lost our language, right? So
mm,
Punjabi was my first language, but I speak it like a toddler now. And my comprehension is probably like that of a young child or maybe a tween. So there's a lot of grief in that. But at that point, like I would stop inviting friends over and I would lie about the Christmas tree and find some random object to say I got for Christmas. That's how deep that sort of sadness was that I wasn't like everyone else.
mm.
When I got my driver's license, that also became like a really profound awakening, understanding how the world saw me. There was just black, white, other. Those were the boxes. There was no Asian. There was no like Pacific Islander or any of these things. And so they would just look at you and decide. And on the driver's license in North Carolina at that time, they put your race. And so for me, they put WF for white female. And then 3 years later, when my sister got her driver's license, so I'm born in October, my sister in June, she had a tan, they put BF for black female on hers. And so it was just like trying to understand like how I was to move through the world, how the world saw me. I knew of India as this beautiful place. My maternal grandparents had a fair amount of wealth. So it was just like going to India and being served cups of chai and going to the rose garden and this like beautiful experience, seeing the Taj Mahal, all this stuff. And then you'd go back to the US and all you'd see is a poor starving child in a care commercial. Like we had these commercials like help sponsor a child in India who's starving. And I didn't know how to express it. I didn't have a way to help people understand, or they'd say, "Oh, you're Indian. What tribe are you?" I'm not Cherokee or Navajo. I'm Indian from India. It's like they didn't even know where it was. So anyhow, all to say, there was a lot of sort of confusion, a lot of longing to fit in, and then a real deepening of kind of my sense of myself as an Indian when I worked at MTV News as the news anchor for MTV Asia and moved to Singapore and then subsequently to India to set up the MTV India news department.
What
And
what
there I
what
was,
year was this? Because I remember
yeah,
MTV India
yeah,
when I was living in Saudi Arabia, and
yeah,
I was a big fan of MTV
yeah,
India at that time. What year was this?
yeah.
90s,
So
late 90s?
it was late 90s, and I was
Yeah.
Preeti Sethi then, Preeti Sethi of MTV News. And it was Sharon Gomez and I were the news anchors. She was
Mm.
part of MTV when it was part of Star, and I was working at MTV in the US at that point and also still in school. So I didn't come until later.
Preeti is
The
your
next
nickname?
Preeti is my legal
Mm.
real name,
Okay.
Preeti Sethi. But when you become famous, when you're on TV in Asia, and MTV Asia had a footprint into Russia. So we were translated into Russian, Mandarin, and then seen like throughout the subcontinent. It's a lot.
Mm.
And when I decided it was time to finish that work and come back to the United States, I didn't want to be associated with that name, like that identity, I should say. I really want to reclaim it now. That's what my parents named me. Preeti means love. Simran, the name I chose for myself, means to be closer to God. So they're both great, but I'd like to reclaim that. But that was when I wasn't the minority. That's such a fallacy. And what that does to a psyche to be the minority, I think is a really like a damaging construct in the sense of like being made small. But there I was, everyone looked like me. And it was a different experience when I lived there for years, as opposed to visiting my grandparents and sitting and having chai in someone's house versus living and working in a place, which wasn't even my home place because my family's from Punjab and I lived in Maharashtra in Mumbai and then traveled all over for MTV. So that was a huge awakening around like who I was as a South Asian woman. And then I called myself an Indian woman. It's really that evolution you asked about partition. I knew it as an abstract. I didn't understand the reality of it until I think I read a book in my late 30s. And even then, I didn't understand. My dad was a refugee. Like, I had no comprehension. And now he's passed on. I never got to ask him. He had a tattoo of an Om. And this was a way to distinguish between Hindus and Muslims. That's a thing. That's a real, and that's not I just thought it was cool, but it's such an astonishing thing to me that I never thought to really understand it. And I think that speaks to a lot of what happens, again, when you immigrate is like these things get buried. Like we don't, broadly as an Asian culture, talk about trauma. And then on top of that, you're just trying to figure out how the hell to figure out America. Do you know what I mean? That there's so many layers to what it means to get along and fit in and belong that what do we let go of? And I think we let go of being able to process some of that or even share it with future generations. My parents never talked to me about, my mom's just now at age 77, really, really waxing nostalgic about her time in Uganda and Rwanda. And I'm learning stuff that I just, for decades, I haven't known.
There's the other level, right? Is how do Indian people actually end up in places like Uganda and Rwanda, which surprises people. As again, you go back even further in history, which is the history of endangered slavery and so on. People are moving around throughout time. I really relate to that because for a place like Bangladesh, which got independence from what was at that time West Pakistan in 1971, where my father was a guerrilla fighter in that war. And even in January when I was back home, we retraced his steps, and in the Liberation War Museum, the very sort of battalion that he was part of was actually in the museum, and he gets super emotional over there. But then a place like Bangladesh, you get defined by the war of independence from Pakistan, but then the history goes even further back, which during the partition, 47, what happened there, right? Hindus and Muslims got split up. But then you go a little farther back, and then so the region of Bengal being one unified race, right, which was like let's just say the jewel of the subcontinent in terms of amount of commerce, literature, culture, right? Such immense education, such immense talent. People talk about Bob Dylan getting the Nobel Prize for Literature. I'm like, no, that was Rabindranath Tagore, the first Bengali to get the Nobel Prize for Literature. It wasn't Bob Dylan, although Bob Dylan was great too. But and then, so of course, you had layers of immigration. You get split up from the culture. You don't even ask those questions because there's no proximity. Who's going to remind you that partition happened? Who's going to remind you that there's that people have been moving around forcibly, have been forced to move for quite some time. So I really resonate with that. I want to come back quickly to a comment you just made, which is when you were a host for MTV India, and then you said that is not an identity. When you move back to the US, it's not somebody you wanted to be anymore. Why was that exactly? You said that people around you looked like you, but it's not somebody you wanted to be.
No, sorry, let me clarify. It was my name. So I was the news anchor. So I would have people walking up to me on the street, Preeti Sethi of MTV News. I was not able to, at certain points, be in public because there was so much awareness of who I was. It was obviously before Instagram and all this stuff, thank God. It was like there was a celebrity there. And so I wanted to shed that skin. Like I was very uncomfortable. I never wanted to be on camera. I was a producer for MTV News. I worked in their documentary division. And then they asked me to be on air when I moved to Singapore to work there, to be actually closer at that point to my boyfriend who worked at MTV Japan. So it just, like, that was the part that I didn't know. I was so proud. I had finally felt a homecoming in my Indian self because I'd been there for long enough that I genuinely, like when you go as someone who lives in the US and you'd put on like salwar kameez or something, like just didn't fit quite right. Like, it's just like the clothes don't quite hang the same way. Yeah. And then they did. Like the way I fit in, I really fit. Yeah. It was a glorious, really sweet time for me.
So what happened when you came to the US? Did you feel more comfortable in your skin, or was that sort of sense of inner conflict back?
I felt more comfortable, but interestingly, I realized, well, there was an extraordinary increase in migration of Mexicans at that point to the place where my family was based in North Carolina. And I'd never seen a Walmart before. I went into a Walmart and like they came up like when I was living in Asia and Singapore and in India. And someone said, "Do you speak English?" And again, these things are just like so insane to me, right? And so wait a minute, I grew up here, but what are you saying? And then it was like, wow, like I'm not being seen as other. I'm now being seen as a Mexican with some vitriol, not just like a benign, hey, you're Mexican. I was like, I'm not going to be able to win here. So that was a really interesting thing. And initially, I think I was really, really very uncomfortable with it. But since that time, I've grown so grateful for being seen by many people and in many places as belonging there. Oh, are you Greek? Are you Italian? Are you Indian? Are you Pakistani? Are you Mexican? Are like where? And that to me is a great gift. But at a certain point, I really did feel some pain around it.
I guess it depends who puts you in the box, right?
And if they're doing it with benevolence, or someone calling me Mexican here who thinks in the back of their mind that you're an illegal is very different from being in Mexico, where I lived for nearly 2 years in the early pandemic. And people being confused that I didn't speak Spanish. Like, no, soy indio. I'm Indian. I'm not.
Right.
But I'm delighted that you think I'm one of you.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So one other thing I want to ask is that you said that when they were giving out these identity cards or IDs, you got WF, which is white female, and your sister got BF, black female. Why did you get white female?
The only thing I can think of is my birthday, it's for it was our driver's license. So the minute I turned 18, I got it, or 16, I guess it was. I don't remember when we get our driver's license anymore. I think it's 16, driver's license, 18 drink.
Yeah.
I immediately went to get my driver's license. And so it was October, there was like the fall. But when my sister went in June to get hers, which is when her birthday is, she had a tan. She'd spent more time in the sun. So I think she just showed up looking a little darker. That was something that couldn't really be known, but it's just, to me, speaks to the idea that like even my own sister and I weren't perceived in the same way by some people.
It reminds me of a story. So back in the day, I helped put together a backpacking trip back to Bangladesh. And really the genesis story of that is that in 2013, Bangladesh suffered one of the worst industrial accidents in the textile sector.
The fires.
There were fires. There was there's a building that was 4-story tall that had a number of structural issues, but it's also one of the subcontractors that companies like Gap and Joe Fresh that get their clothes manufactured there. So despite all the flaws, this factory was allowed to operate, and then it collapsed one day, trapping about 1,200 people. Majority were young women who were manufacturing clothing for these global brands, Walmart, Joe Fresh, and Gap included. It was by far the worst industrial accident in that space. And one of the things I wanted to do right after that, and it's not that I was very conscious, I wasn't a big shopper, but I also didn't care about when my clothes were being made, the stories behind the people making your clothes. And so I organized a backpacking trip. At that time, I still believe it's still the only immersive backpacking program in the world, which takes fashion designers from around the world to Bangladesh on a 2-week backpacking trip. It's very rough and tumble, very immersive. But the reason I bring this up is that if I go back to Bangladesh by myself, everybody thinks I'm Bangladeshi. And because I was doing the program, and it just happens that majority of the people who attended the program, were all white women from the West. The moment I would hang out with them, nobody would even question that I was Bangladeshi. It was automatically, everybody spoke to me was always in English. And they even didn't assume that I spoke Bangla. So there's say stuff around me, and they didn't think I would know. So it's just really funny when you talk about how people perceive you depending on, let's say, its setting. It really just reminded me of that story. It was hilarious. And in those settings, if I actually went back to people who were staring at us and I spoke in Bangla, they were shocked completely. It's like, how does this? Why is this brown guy hanging out with 5 white girls? What's happening?
I know, seriously. And oh no, what did we just say about him? Yeah.
No, so that was really funny. I'm gonna come to this. I want to move to your what feels like a lifelong career. Just hearing about you and knowing what you're working on, but there's also this what feels like a pursuit of truth or unearthing truth or bringing light to things that are not talked about often, which all falls under the umbrella, what I feel like is journalism. And you've been a journalist for a long time. I want to talk about why journalism. And before you talk about your career as a journalist, I have this question to you, which is, what is journalism? And I ask that from the perspective of, to me, I thought journalism or a journalist is somebody who, again, unravels the truth or brings light to the truth. But in the state of the world that we have today, the truth is becoming increasingly, in some cases, relative, for the lack of a better word. What is a journal? What does a journalist do, and what is journalism? Maybe let's start there.
Yeah. So I used to be a journalism professor as well, and this is not in a textbook definition, but what's coming to me right now is that someone who is committed to documenting and sharing about the multiple truths that exist in the world today, and with an eye to serving the public interest. So considering that definition, I don't think that there are many outlets that consistently do that. And when I say multiple truths, what I'm talking about is maybe multiple perspectives. Not to say, and this has been such a dramatic problem and that I faced as an environmental journalist, was a false equivalence. So let's say the IPC, right, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I was an environmental reporter, says that scientists say with 99% certainty that climate change is real, right? But what we would do is, not me per se, but the royal journalist, we would talk to the 1% and talk to the 99%, right? The one skeptic plus the solid scientific community, and give them each equal airtime. And so the public became very confused. And I think that, to me, is one of the greatest tragedies of what journalism has become with the 24-hour news cycle, plus like every platform that you can get news on. There's a demand for a lot of filler material. And so I think there's a real distortion. Like, I can run a 6-minute story on Paris Hilton's autobiography, but I'm going to give 2 minutes to like what's going on with Narendra Modi trying to like silence journalists, like to keep it full circle with journalists, that like what's going to sell, what's going to get the eyeballs, or what's going to get the ears, or what's going to get the clicks. And that is like what we're chasing now, as opposed to what is going to make democracy around the world stronger, what is going to build an informed electorate, what is going to keep people healthy and safe. How can we be critical in our assessment of our political candidates, when now I think there's a lot of kowtowing, genuflecting to candidates to the point where it's just, we don't want to lose that side, right? We need those listeners, or more importantly, like we need access to that politician. So if we upset them, then their office is just not going to grant us another interview. And that, to me, is deeply troubling. Now, of course, there's still extraordinary investigative journalism going on, but I think there's just a much greater focus on bottom line as opposed to like the integrity of what serving the public interest is all about.
I agree with that definition. Having no background in journalism, I still relate to that idea that presenting multiple versions of the truth or multiple perspectives of the truth and letting the audience decide. It does beg the question, though, is how do you build the capacity in your audience to perceive multiple truths or hold space for it? Because and this perhaps relates to what I believe is the true power of psychedelics, whether it's holding multiple truths, inner truths, versions of the truth in yourself, or what you perceive from the outside. How do you build that sort of capacity in audience? I think that's really part of the issue. I find there's so much information.
Yeah, I think we have to build people's ability to think critically and analyze the information that comes in. When I say multiple truths, what I mean is that there's a real temptation, especially in the more polarized outlets, to say X is good or X is bad. We have 3 minutes to talk about something, or we have 60 seconds to talk about something, and go, right? And so we're going to end up with a story that just says, this is good or this is bad. It's going to be declarative. And that's what sort of the medium seems to demand, is like there's a singular answer. Leaving people with a bunch of questions at the end is not acceptable in many places, but it should be. Because the truth is, it's not easy to say. I wish I could give like an immediate example, something that's coming to mind. You can't see this, right? But it's like half full or half empty, this mug. It's both. But if I'm only looking at it and telling you it's half full, I'm not explaining like the other half, like something is missing. You know what I mean? And I guess I'll talk about, let me give a better example here. When I worked as an environmental reporter, it was in a time when people were really excited about shopping our way to sustainability. And I was very much a part of that conversation. Now, I wanted to explain the electrical grid so people could understand if you bought an eco-efficient light bulb, why that would matter. But no one allowed me to tell that story because they thought it was boring. No one wants to hear about infrastructure. Just tell them what to buy, right? So that to me is a great example. So I was going on show after show for Oprah and the Today Show. I worked for NBC and like NBC News and all these outlets, but all they would let me do was speak to the very tip of the iceberg. They wouldn't let me explain environmental injustice. These things are now cropping up, but when I tried to tell these stories a long time ago, they would much rather talk about eco-friendly fashion. Do you know what I mean? Than like the impacts of carbon emissions. There's no way like the industrial disaster in Bangladesh was going to get more than a couple of days coverage because like people don't even know where Bangladesh is in the United States.
That's true.
So that sort of thing. And they don't care. They'll buy Gap. Like if like Justin Bieber does a line with Gap, they'll write multiple stories on that, but you're probably going to get one. Do you know what I mean? Or two about a building collapse. And that is where I think we run into a lot of problems.
Yeah, totally true. Actually, with the Rana Plaza collapse, what was surprising to me, as of course,
That's
like Bangladesh, there's no positive correlation, right? It's always, Bangladesh, it's where disaster, poverty, corruption, debts, and nothing good comes out of Bangladesh. And so from that perspective, the framing wasn't surprising. But what I did see, I remember the coverage lasted for 2 weeks almost, which was unlike any other thing in Bangladesh. But I think then came a number of documentaries, just the extent of the disaster and the fact that it was mostly women, young women, working women who were not only supporting their families, but they were part of this new narrative in Bangladesh, which is like empowered women who were not working at other people's homes anymore as indentured slaves to some point, to some degree, but they're really taking their lives into their hand. It was a different, I guess, the way the story kind of tailed off it felt different at that time. But I want to come back to this point around, so how do you make stories that are emotionally resonant, not prescriptive, but actually does allow people to, it informs people, but also allows people to ask really important questions. And I'm asking this particular question from perspective of your book, which is Bread, Wine, and Chocolate. Now, this book I haven't read it yet, but it sounds fantastic just from the description. And I have a particular sort of question around the framing of this book without having read it, just based on the description. And I'm going to read the description out for everybody, for the audience here. And so one of the descriptions I found on your website was that, not the whole description, but a part of it is that in the last century, we have lived and eaten through the most dramatic shifts ever experienced in food and agriculture. While most of this is invisible, what we do know is that food is beginning to look and taste the same, whether you're strolling through a San Francisco farmer's market, at a Midwestern potluck, or a McDonald's in India. 95% of the world's calories now come from only 30 species, and a closer look at America's cornucopia of grocery store options reveals that our food is primarily made of only corn, wheat, rice, palm oil, and soybeans. Food itself, the most delicious, diverse varieties of food, is being lost slowly and irrevocably. I want to ask you, how does food relate to language? Now, one of my most favorite writers is Wade Davis, because I find he has such an incredible gift of language, of poetry. He's currently a professor at UBC. He wrote multiple books and he spent lots of time with indigenous peoples around the world. And he's an ethnobotanist as well. But one of the things that he's been talking about for a while is that nearly half the indigenous languages in the world, 7,000 documented languages, have also disappeared. Is there a correlation or a relationship between the loss of indigenous foods or diversity of food and language? And what is that relationship in your mind?
Yes. Yeah. It's not a relationship in my mind. It's data. It's, and I've lectured at UBC about this actually, but the book is about the loss of agricultural biodiversity told through the lens of bread, wine, coffee, chocolate, and beer. So it's looking at soil, seed, pollinator, microbe loss and what the implications of that are. I went to the deep origins of our foods. I spent 5 years on 6 continents writing this book, including going to Ethiopia and to India, to the Golden Temple, tracing like our sacred Kara Prasad back to the wheat fields of India. But to speak about that correlation, there's a direct correlation between biodiversity loss and the loss of language. So if you think about the homogenization of foods, of fields, of clothing, of culture, the demand to eat the same number of foods and the same types of foods, wear the same kinds of clothes, speak the same language, results in an erosion of the fabric of our cultures. And I'm noticing the time here and that we have about 15 minutes left. So I would love to build a bridge here to psychedelics, because I think there's a very profound thing that's happening here as well. There is definitely a beauty in honoring and celebrating diverse cultures and being able to work with the healing traditions from those cultures, whether it be the Shipibo people in ayahuasca or the Bwiti people in Iboga, or the lineage, those sacred mushrooms that have come through Maria Sabina, and the many hands that have stewarded our foods, our medicines, our languages. Like, they get taken and they get distorted and they get appropriated, and something is lost when everything becomes simply a commodity. And, what I have found, in addition to being a journalist, I would call myself a storyteller as a through line of my life. People are made of stories, and my job was to really uncover them, not to tell them for other people, but to create space so these underreported stories like biodiversity loss in food and agriculture could be told. And I feel like if you think about the narrative, even of something like yoga or meditation in the global north, someone who practices yoga is probably a thin white woman. And this is like from our culture. Like, these are ancient practices that I would see my nani, my grandmother, doing a version of Surya Namaskar, like sun salutation, meditation, and pranayama, like this idea of breath work. It's like, where did Stan Groff get this from? He admits it's inspired by pranayama, like the awareness of the breath, altered states of consciousness. This is all part of our Asian lineage. And I think when we go into medicine space, and here I'll speak for myself, I don't want to say we, but maybe like a chant in the background that's a sacred chant to me, a Sikh mantra, mispronounced by someone, and I'm in this deep medicine experience, and what's coming in is, this is not mine anymore. This has been taken, or that it's taking me. I'm trying to go back to my ancestor and my ancestors and my lineage, but it's been blocked. Or I'm spying like a Ganesh in the corner that's like decoration for somebody, but again, that's a sacred god. So these things. New age stuff has been conflated with like Asian stuff, whether it's like Buddhism or whatever, and often out of context or without any acknowledgement or appreciation. This came from a place. And I think that can be quite painful and quite isolating. And what I found when I started to reach for psychedelics after decades of managing depression, it just became unmanageable during especially the pandemic and a lot of isolation and just a lot of stuff going on, and got to a point of like suicidal ideation. But even though I was taking Prozac and Xanax and trying, it was just like, it felt like a thick blanket. It didn't feel like integrated healing. And a friend suggested psychedelics, and I started doing all the reading. As a good journalist, I did all the research. I was like, okay, quieting the default mode network. All right, that sounds good. Like, I want that. But what I didn't know, because I'd only ever use psychedelics recreationally without any consciousness around these healing qualities, like acid in my teens, ecstasy in my 20s, like weed all throughout, but not with this idea, with this understanding of this. And I was like, what they didn't say was, you will feel a connection to your father who you haven't felt his presence since he passed away 7 years ago. You will receive the forgiveness that you sought from your grandmother. That the last time I saw her, I felt like I wasn't the way I wanted to be with her. You will feel your mom's little girl self getting on that boat from Uganda, and you will understand why she's been so hard on you. Like, this is the preciousness of psychedelics. But in Asian culture, and I know that speaking really broadly, we're not a monolith, but there's a lot we have in common with our East Asian brothers and sisters, with West and Central Asian family, like the cultures, the values, the qualities around immigration, the pressure around being the model minority, all these things like are resonant. And I feel Western culture has tried to say like Asian means East Asian and South Asian something else. But when we think of South Asian, we don't really think of Bangladesh or Iran. We're really just talking about India and maybe Pakistan. Like they've done this thing. No one even thinks about Kazakhstan. Like the fourth largest country in the world is Central Asia. So reclaiming that, reclaiming our medicines, reclaiming our relationship with entheogens, and I like to say extraordinary states of consciousness instead of altered. These are our birthright. This healing is our birthright. And it's mental health and drug use have been so stigmatized in Asian community. I founded an organization that would help us find a place where we could speak about our stuff and feel safe and be able to put down our armor and be able to not have to defer to someone else's trauma or try to make ourselves seem okay, but just to exhale and be held and know that however you show up, you are welcome here.
That's beautiful. And it's such a good segue to talk about Asian Psychedelic Collective, because you and I connected first when you had the intention. You didn't have a logo at that time, but to see it to come to fruition, it's such a beautiful, vibrant community of people is so wonderful. So let's talk about the Asian Psychedelic Collective. Tell me about the genesis story and what has the response been so far? You mentioned that the Asia is not a monolith. It has many different cultures and many different stories, but there are unifying narratives here. What are those narratives and how has that been received by the community?
Yeah. It's interesting. So I'll first of all explain how I connected to you. Again, using all my journalist skills, I had a couple of experiences. I had a medicine experience that was really powerful around my family and my ancestors. I didn't feel like I could integrate with white folks because they didn't understand my experience. So then I sought out, again, around partition and everything I was describing. So then I sought out BIPOC groups. But again, it was like, I was the only Asian in there. Like it wasn't quite the right fit. And we need to have space for Black trauma. And that is not the same. I think this idea of BIPOC or people of color is just so unfortunate in a way. I want us to be a family together. And I also want to name that like our traumas aren't the same. So if you go into a practitioner training and all you're getting is some generic BIPOC training, that doesn't make you equipped to take care of people in their specificity. And I can't speak to Canada. And I mean, there are a lot of South Asians in Canada. At least that because my people are there. I'm sure maybe big Asian too. It's like in the United States, Asians are the fastest growing ethno-racial group in this country. In Oregon, we are the fastest growing ethno-racial group in the country. How are people being trained to serve our community and understand what's coming up for us when we're in liminal space and being able to hold us, being able to support us, being able to integrate with us? I couldn't find that. So I started scrolling through LinkedIn. I did a search on psychedelics and every name that sounded Asian to me, like including yours, I was like, hi, you might remember this. It's like, my name is Simran. I'm part of a small group of people putting together this collective. It was just me at the time. And it was born out of not being able to find like the right fit for integration, having an experience in a psychedelic justice class where the professor just like dismissed East Asians. Like, y'all haven't had any trouble. Like, so the historical naivete, I want to say, because if you're educated, again, I'm speaking to the US, in this system, you don't learn about anything other than the dominant culture, right? So like internment is like a page in a history book. Forget about knowing about anything that's actually happened in Asia. But Asians are 2 out of 3 people on the planet, and we have faced the disproportionate impacts. Every war, famine, displacement, internment, enslavement, colonization. I don't want to say disproportionate impacts of everything. There's been a lot of that, of course, in Africa, but climate crisis, all of this, the wars, like we have faced it. But when people see us here, they just think we're okay. Oh, the doctors and the engineers and the what have you. The largest income disparity is within the Asian community in the United States. We are not one thing, but we are seen as being this kind of super smart breed of folks. And that's really damaging for a couple of reasons. But first, because it erases our humanity, because then we can't speak to our vulnerabilities. And then that's exacerbated by the fact that like our culture doesn't talk about this stuff. And then it creates a hierarchy where if I'm the model minority, what's that other person? It's separating us from our other communities of color, which I'm really, really pained by. So I think it looks on its face like a great thing, like we're the model minority, but then you just dig a little bit deeper and you're like, that's not really serving us. So yeah, I lost my train of thought there, but I want to also add that we're underrepresented in clinical trials. We are underrepresented in practitioner trainings. We are underrepresented across the board. And also when we are there, we're not seen. So you have a book like How to Change Your Mind that gives you like a paragraph in the beginning about Maria Sabina and then 3 at the end, but it's Gordon Wasson gets more pages. Everything else is white men in white lab coats. I know the Netflix special was better, but let's stay with the book for a minute because pollen is so influential. Like just even there, the erasure. And then I see that my dad was a scientist, so I'm particularly attuned to that. If he was erased, his labor was erased. And we're not, again, a culture that like waves the pom-poms for ourselves. So APC is here to advocate, right? We're here built on 3 pillars of building community. We have integration circles and wellness circles. Our integration circles to honor our intersections. So we're not just one thing. We're not just one kind of Asian, and we're also not just one kind of person. So we have a LGBTQIA plus circle, an immigrant first generation circle. We're rolling out our women femme circle, our men's circle. We have a general circle as well. We have sound healing. We have yoga. We're soon to have meditation. And this is all by Asian for Asian, to have these safe spaces for ourselves. We have education as our second pillar. And that's really about, and this was all informed by like conversation with you, plus like 100 plus other people. Like I spoke to people and asked them, what would you want in an organization to feel a sense of belonging? Right. So APC, the Asian Psychedelic Collective, is a place of belonging, an emergent space of belonging for Asians working in and with psychedelics. And it's built on these pillars of community, like I just mentioned, education, which is really about also talking about like how to talk to your Asian family about psychedelics, right? We're going to be rolling out that resource and other resources that we've curated, and a drug war healing circle, an Asian drug war healing circle brought to us by the Center for Political Education. Like they are 2 Asian women who are now like carrying this into APC, but to explain the war on drugs and how that's been damaging to us here in the global north as well as in Asia, you know, how that's impacted policy and culture, our culture around drugs. And then really hoping to create educational modules so there will be that sensitivity in psychedelic practitioner trainings. And then the third pillar is advocacy. And it's not advocacy for psychedelics. This is for some people, but like you said at the top, it's not for everyone. We're not here to just universally say this is what everyone should do, but to advocate for our place here. If we are going to have this, it needs to be accessible. It needs to be culturally accessible and financially accessible. We need to, again, have culturally responsive and attuned care, and advocate again for us to be there in all those places, in the trials, in the research, in the leadership positions, in spaces, in investment like you matter. And when someone sees like Rod's there, that means that like maybe they have a belief that they could be there too. And I mean, I sat very recently with my 77-year-old mom, and that liberation that she has felt, like I want that. I want that for our people more than anything. I want that for our people.
So powerful and so beautifully said. Simran, thank you so much. I know we're almost out of time. I just want to acknowledge that the work that you're putting in, the work that you're doing to bring us all together has been incredibly powerful, and just the timing couldn't be better. So maybe tell us how to find APC.
Yeah, Asian Psychedelic Collective.org. Sign up for our mailing list. And then in addition to that, Instagram at Asian Psychedelic Collective. Those are the best places. We're also on LinkedIn, but we're a very small organization, all volunteer led. So we want people to please show up. All of our events are donation based, so no one's turned away. And we're really like hopeful to build this community and even have folks come on board and volunteer with us. That'd be great.
Simran, thanks so much. Good luck with APC and everything else. I look forward to, again, remaining friends and spending more time together. Thanks so much again for spending time here. This podcast was brought to life with the help of Carolyn Tripp on art and design. Thanks so much for listening to Minority Trip Report. If you're learning from or enjoying the podcast, please subscribe to MTR on YouTube at Minority Trip Report and follow us on Instagram at Minority Trip. It's a zero-cost way to support us and help us spread the word. Please also sign up with your email for new episode announcements, events, as well as our forthcoming newsletter. I'm your host, Rod Suraj. See you next time.